Madeline Torres had always believed that her home was more than just a place to sleep. It was a refuge carefully shaped over years of quiet, deliberate living, a space where every clock on the wall ticked in a harmony and every window framed a picture of stillness. She lived in a modest but well-kept townhouse on a narrow, tree-lined street, where the air in the early mornings carried the faint smell of dew and old wood, and where her small workshop for repairing antique clocks sat attached to the rear of the house like a secret she shared only with customers who appreciated her craft. Her bedroom faced a narrow service passage that ran between her home and the back of the neighboring property, a space that was almost always deserted except for the occasional delivery man or the fleeting shadow of a stray cat. The silence of that side of the house was part of why she had chosen it in the first place. The other side of the street was busier, with traffic and people, but here, the soundscape was so delicate that she could hear the faintest creak of her workshop's wooden floorboards when the air shifted. Over the years, she had maintained a cordial, if distant, relationship with most of the neighbors, never looking for trouble and never giving anyone a reason to think she was anything but polite. Yet there was one neighbor, Karen Miller, who had a way of inserting herself into conversations and situations without invitation, always smiling in that way that seemed meant to disarm but somehow managed to unsettle. Karen was known for her lively gatherings, the kind that went on long after midnight with bursts of laughter, clinking glasses, and music that spilled into the street in defiance of whatever quiet hour the rest of the residents kept. At first, Madeline had tried to ignore it, telling herself that everyone had a right to enjoy their property, but as the frequency and volume of those nights increased, she began to feel the intrusion seeping into her own life, eroding the calm she depended on to focus on her intricate work. The first time she approached Karen about it, she chose her words carefully, mentioning that the music sometimes made it difficult to sleep and wondering if perhaps it could be turned down after a certain hour. Karen had smiled warmly, agreed in a tone that sounded cooperative, and then done absolutely nothing to change. After a few more sleepless nights, Madeline began filing formal noise complaints, following the exact channels provided by the residential management, thinking that if she stuck to the process, the matter would resolve without confrontation. But the process seemed slow and indifferent, and the more she pressed the issue, the more she noticed subtle changes in Karen's behavior, a lingering look when they passed each other in the parking lot, an exaggerated greeting in front of other neighbors that carried an edge of mockery. It was after one such brief but uncomfortable encounter in the small grocery store down the street that Madeline's unease sharpened. Karen had been leaning on her cart, chatting idly about the weather, when her tone shifted just enough to make the words stand out. "Let's see how you sleep this week," she said with that same sweet smile, the words framed as casual but heavy with something that felt like intent. Madeline tried to brush it off as a petty jab, but it stuck with her all the way home, lingering in the back of her mind as the sun went down and the familiar quiet settled over her house, the kind of quiet she had always trusted, until that night, when she would discover just how fragile it really was. It was the kind of noise that didn't just wake you up, it invaded your sleep like an alarm you hadn't set, tearing through the quiet with a raw, mechanical roar that seemed to have no beginning or end. Madeline came awake in darkness, her heart pounding, disoriented for a moment as she tried to place the sound. It wasn't the muffled thump of music from next door or the occasional hum of the streetlights outside. It was heavier, angrier, vibrating through the walls and floor as if the house itself had been dropped beside a factory. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and the sound swelled in waves, rattling the glass in her window frames. Pulling on a sweater, she crossed the room and looked outside, and the sight made her stop cold. Barely 6 feet from her bedroom window, in the narrow service passage she had always thought of as a forgotten strip of concrete and weeds, sat a massive industrial generator, its metal casing glinting under the glare of portable construction lamps. Thick cables coiled from its sides like snakes, disappearing toward the fence line, and the air shimmered faintly around the exhaust pipe as heat poured into the night. Someone had gone out of their way to wedge it into this tight space, a spot so specific that the sound would hit her bedroom like a sledgehammer while leaving the rest of the street largely untouched. There was a laminated sign bolted to its side that read, in block letters, Noise Level Testing. Authorized equipment. Do not tamper. The absurdity of the words almost made her laugh, but the laugh never came. It was nearly 3 a.m, and this wasn't a random inconvenience. It was deliberate. She glanced up and down the passage, but there was no one there, no sign of the people who had brought the machine in. The light from the lamps was harsh, flattening every shadow, and for a strange moment she felt as though she were on a stage, exposed to anyone who might be watching from the dark. Closing the curtain halfway, she reached for her phone and called the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation in as calm a voice as she could manage, though she could hear the edge creeping in despite herself. The dispatcher asked for her address and put her on hold briefly, the faint clicks of a keyboard filtering through before she came back with a flat response. The equipment was on what was considered common access property. The police had no jurisdiction unless there was an immediate safety hazard, and she should take it up with the property management. Madeline tried to explain that the placement was targeted, that it was keeping her from sleeping, but the dispatcher's tone didn't shift. The call ended with a polite but empty assurance that the report would be on file. Frustrated but unwilling to let it go, she put on her coat over her pajamas and stepped outside, the cold air hitting her face as she made her way around the block, to the entrance of the passage. The noise was overwhelming out here, the generator's roar filling her ears like standing next to a jet engine. As she approached, she saw the uniformed night guard who patrolled the complex standing a few feet away, leaning on the wall and scrolling through his phone. She asked him directly if he knew who had put the machine there, and he glanced at her with a faint shrug, saying only that he'd been told it was part of an approved maintenance procedure. When she pressed for details, who approved it, why it had to be done at 3 a.m. He didn't meet her eyes, muttered something about just doing his job, and returned to his screen. She stood there for a moment, watching the exhaust vent spitting heat into the air, the low metallic rumble pressing into her chest like a physical weight. The sign, the timing, the location. It was too clean to be random. She thought of Karen's words in the grocery store, the smugness wrapped in something almost playful, and the pieces began to slide together in a way that made her stomach tighten. Still, there was no one to confront, no proof to wave in anyone's face. She turned back inside, the sound following her through the thin walls until she shut herself in the bathroom at the far end of the house, where it was only slightly muted. She sat on the edge of the tub, staring at the tiled floor, feeling the hours stretch as the generator droned on without pause, every second a reminder that someone had chosen to put it there and that it would keep running until they decided it had done whatever they meant it to do. When dawn finally came, it brought no relief, only the sight of the generator still in place, still roaring, as if it had been built into the ground overnight. By the time the sun edged high enough to burn off the pale haze above the rooftops, she had stopped expecting it to end quickly, and she knew with the kind of clarity that arrives when you are too tired to doubt yourself that this was not a test for anyone's benefit but the people who wanted to make a point at her expense. By the time the generator finally went silent, the day had already turned heavy with the muted light of an overcast morning, the kind where the sky feels lower than usual and the air carries the damp scent of something unfinished. Madeline had not slept at all. Instead, she had alternated between pacing her kitchen with a mug of coffee that never seemed to stay warm and standing at the bedroom window, watching for any sign of movement in the passage. There was none until just before 9 when a flatbed truck rolled slowly up the lane, reversing with the kind of precision that comes from having rehearsed the maneuver. 2 men climbed down from the cab, one stocky with a close-cropped haircut and mirrored sunglasses despite the weak light, the other taller and thinner, his jacket zipped to the throat and his cap pulled low. They didn't glance at her window, didn't say a word to each other, just unhooked the cables, wheeled the generator onto the truck bed using a steel ramp, and secured it with the brisk, economical movements of people who knew they weren't going to be interrupted. Madeline stayed where she was, resisting the urge to rush outside and demand answers, sensing that such an approach would accomplish nothing but letting them see that the night had gotten to her. Instead, she memorized the truck's license plate and the faint logo painted on the door, a half-faded graphic that looked like the outline of a warehouse with a name she couldn't fully make out from the distance. The moment they drove away, she wrote it all down, not trusting fatigue to preserve the details. She called the property management office and was transferred twice before a clipped, impatient voice told her that the equipment had been part of standard maintenance testing and was no longer on site, so there was nothing to discuss. When she pressed for the nature of the test, who authorized it, and why it had to be conducted directly outside her bedroom window in the middle of the night, the voice on the other end grew cooler, repeating that all procedures were within guidelines and suggesting she put any further concerns in writing. It was the second time in less than 12 hours that she had heard the phrase within guidelines, and it didn't feel coincidental. By early afternoon, her exhaustion had calcified into something sharper, a quiet determination that came with recognizing that whoever orchestrated this had not only the ability, but also the confidence to shield themselves behind official language and vague authority. She decided she would follow the instruction to put her concerns in writing, but not to the management office. She drafted a formal complaint addressed to the city's department responsible for environmental and noise regulation, citing the specific time frame, the measured proximity to her sleeping quarters, and the sustained decibel level she estimated based on her own familiarity with industrial machinery. She requested a review of whether such an installation could be considered compliant with municipal codes, and she made sure to keep a copy of every word she sent. Later that day, as she stepped outside to collect the mail, she noticed Karen across the street, standing with her hip cocked and a paper coffee cup in hand, talking animatedly to a neighbor. When their eyes met, Karen's smile flickered into something narrower, and she raised her cup slightly as though in a toast. Madeline said nothing, only returned inside, the exchange small but unmistakable in its intent. That evening, she decided to take a walk around the block, partly to shake off the claustrophobic feeling that had settled in the house, partly to see if the generator, or anything like it, was set up anywhere else. It wasn't. But she did notice that in the alley 2 streets over, there was a similar flatbed truck parked with its cab facing out toward the main road. The logo was clearer here, and she recognized it as belonging to a logistics and equipment rental company based just outside the city. She knew better than to approach the truck or the driver, who was leaning back in the seat with his hat over his eyes, but she filed the detail away. By the time she returned home, a thick envelope had been slipped into her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a printed notice from the property management referencing unsubstantiated noise complaints, and advising that excessive use of such complaints could result in administrative review of tenancy. It was a warning, couched in formal language, but a warning nonetheless. The letter did not mention the generator, not once, but the timing was too precise to mistake it for anything else. Madeline read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a folder where she was now keeping every scrap of correspondence, every note, every plate number. She was tired, but she was no longer reacting blindly. If someone was trying to push her into a mistake, an outburst, a confrontation that could be turned against her, she would not give them the satisfaction. She would move deliberately, methodically, and in ways that left her steps documented, even if it meant enduring the unease that now settled over her home like a second, heavier roof. The following week unfolded in a way that made it difficult for Madeline to decide whether the situation was escalating by design or whether she was simply becoming more attuned to the signs that had always been there. The generator incident had left her on edge, but she refused to let that tension dictate her choices, and so she made a conscious effort to continue her routine, opening her clock repair shop at 9 sharp, keeping her appointments, and walking to the small market down the street each evening for fresh bread and coffee. Yet, even in the steadiness of habit, there were interruptions that seemed too specific to be accidental. On Tuesday morning, she found a printed flyer slipped under her door advertising late-night maintenance services from a company she didn't recognize, the design cheap and the contact number unlisted in any online directory. On Wednesday, a delivery van she hadn't ordered idled outside her home for several minutes before driving away without knocking or leaving a package. These incidents on their own might have been harmless, but together they felt like threads in a larger weave, and she began to suspect that someone was deliberately testing the limits of her patience and her sense of security. That suspicion hardened into something more concrete on Thursday, when she stopped at the corner cafe and was approached by Greg, the owner of the small auto repair shop a few blocks over, a man she had known in passing for years but rarely spoken to. Beyond polite greetings, he lowered his voice as soon as he mentioned the generator, glancing over his shoulder before telling her that he had been outside on the night in question, closing up his garage when he saw two men unloading it from a truck around 2:30 in the morning. He described them in the same way she remembered, the stocky one with the close-cropped hair and mirrored sunglasses, the taller one with the cap pulled low, but added a detail she hadn't known. One of them had been at the neighborhood bar with Karen A. Sears week earlier, and the two of them had left together. Greg made it clear he wasn't looking to be drawn into anything official, but he thought she should know. Madeline thanked him, keeping her expression neutral, but inside she felt the shape of the situation shifting. This was no longer just a vague suspicion. Still, she knew better than to try to chase it down herself. Instead, she returned home and drafted a formal statement for the city's Environmental Compliance Office, attaching the details Greg had provided and noting the potential connection between the men and the party host who had been the subject of her noise complaints. She delivered it in person, ensuring she received a stamped copy for her records. The clerk who accepted it scanned the document, her brows drawing together slightly before she said that the department had already received 2 other unrelated complaints about industrial noise from residents in nearby streets over the past month. She didn't elaborate, but the comment lodged itself in Madeline's thoughts as she walked back. That evening, just after she had closed the shop and was locking the front door, she saw Karen standing at the far end of the block, talking animatedly to a pair of men she didn't recognize, one of whom wore a jacket with a small embroidered patch that seemed vaguely familiar. Their conversation broke off when Karen spotted her, and for a fleeting second there was no smile, no pretense, just a flat, measuring look before Karen turned back to her companions. The next morning, an official-looking envelope was waiting in her mailbox, this one bearing the seal of the city's Department of Building Services. Inside was a notice that a structural noise insulation assessment had been requested for her property, and that an inspector would arrive the following week to conduct measurements inside and outside the building. There was no indication of who had made the request, and the form stated that such assessments could be initiated upon credible report of community noise concerns, the exact phrasing vague enough to cover anything. Madeline read it twice, recognizing both the potential threat and the potential opportunity. An inspection meant someone from the city would be inside her home, documenting the conditions, which could work in her favor if the generator incident or anything like it happened again. She called the listed number, confirmed the appointment, and made a point of asking for the inspector's name, which she wrote down immediately. Over the next few days, she took the quiet but deliberate step of speaking to a few other residents, people she trusted not to feed anything back to Karen, and found that at least 2 of them had noticed odd activity at night in the past month. Unmarked vehicles parking for long stretches, the sound of heavy equipment being moved, and in one case a stack of metal barriers left in a cul-de-sac before disappearing the next morning. None of them had filed complaints, but they agreed that something was happening. Madeline didn't push them for more. She simply noted the patterns, her mental map of the situation growing more defined. When Monday arrived, she spent the morning in her workshop trying to focus on repairing a delicate French mantel clock, but her thoughts kept returning to the upcoming inspection and what it might reveal. In the late afternoon, as she stepped out to bring in a shipment from a supplier, she saw an unfamiliar van parked 2 houses down, the driver sitting behind the wheel, watching the street with the stillness of someone waiting for a specific moment. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't move, and after a long minute she went back inside, locking the door behind her. That night, for the first time since the generator had been removed, she kept the bedroom curtains fully closed and slept with a small light on in the hallway, not because she thought it would keep anyone away, but because she was done pretending, that she wasn't aware of what was unfolding around her. The day of the inspection began with a cold, metallic light filtering through the clouds, the kind of sky that seems to flatten all sound and make every movement feel slower than it is. Madeline had woken early, not because she was anxious, but because she wanted to ensure everything in the house was in order and that there would be no distraction from whatever the inspector might document. At precisely 9:30, a tall man in a dark city-issued jacket arrived, introduced himself as Daniel Price, and produced both his badge and a clipboard with the inspection order. He was polite but formal, his eyes scanning the space as she led him inside, taking notes on the state of the walls, windows, and flooring. When they reached the bedroom, he paused for a moment, noting the narrow passage outside and remarking that the proximity of any industrial equipment to that window would almost certainly exceed recommended decibel levels during nighttime hours. She gave a measured explanation of the generator incident without embellishment, careful to keep it factual, and he nodded, saying he would note the specifics in his report. He spent nearly an hour both inside and outside the property, taking measurements and photos before thanking her and assuring her she would receive a copy of the findings. As he left, she noticed an unmarked white SUV idling at the end of the block, its driver partially obscured by the visor. The vehicle pulled away slowly as Daniel got into his own car, and though it could have been coincidence, the timing struck her as too clean to ignore. That afternoon, as she returned from a brief errand, she found a plain manila envelope leaning against her front door. Inside was a single page typed in a blocky, uneven font, with the words, "Stop making trouble," centered on the sheet. There was no signature, no logo, nothing to indicate who had sent it, but the message was so stripped of nuance that it carried more weight than something longer might have. She placed it into her growing folder of documents, making a note of the exact date and time she found it. 2 days later, an email arrived from the property management office with the subject line, "Notice of Policy Review," informing her that her tenancy was under review for repeated misuse of complaint channels, a phrase that seemed to mirror the earlier letter slipped into her mailbox. There was no mention of the inspection, no acknowledgement that the generator event had even occurred, just the clear implication that she was now the one being scrutinized. She resisted the urge to respond immediately, instead forwarding the message to the city department handling her noise complaint and noting in her cover letter that she believed the communication to be retaliatory. The reply she received the next morning from an administrative coordinator was brief but telling. Her initial complaint had been forwarded to the city's legal office for review. That development might have offered a measure of reassurance, but any relief was undercut by what happened that night. Shortly after 11, while she was in the workshop repairing a bracket clock, she heard the deep, throaty rumble of heavy machinery idling somewhere nearby. The sound was faint at first, almost easy to mistake for distant traffic, but it grew steadily louder until it was clear that the source was moving closer. She stepped quietly into the darkened hallway, peering through the front window just in time to see a flatbed truck pass slowly under the street lamp, its cargo partially covered by a tarp. The shape was unmistakable, the squared edges of a generator casing, and though she could not be certain it was the same one, the sight froze her where she stood. The truck did not stop in front of her house but continued down the block, disappearing into the shadows at the far end. She remained by the window for several minutes, listening for any sound of unloading, but none came. Whether it was a deliberate pass or simply a delivery elsewhere, the effect was the same. The reminder that the equipment could return at any time. The next morning, she called Greg at the auto shop, not to press him for more details, but to ask if he had noticed any unusual vehicle traffic the night before. He hesitated before saying that the same unmarked white SUV she had seen during the inspection had been parked near his shop for almost an hour that evening, the driver, inside the whole time. Madeline thanked him, adding another piece to the puzzle forming in her mind. By the end of the week, her file of documents had grown thick, each page a fragment of a larger pattern that she was beginning to understand but could not yet prove. She had stopped thinking of the situation as a conflict between neighbors. Whatever Karen's role, the machinery moving around her felt bigger, organized in a way that implied coordination beyond petty grievances. That understanding did not make her feel safer, but it did solidify her decision to keep every step measured, every action documented, because the more they tried to push her into a reaction, the more determined she became to leave them with nothing they could use. The confirmation came on a gray Thursday morning, not through some dramatic confrontation, but in the form of a sealed envelope from the city's Department of Environmental Compliance. Madeline had been expecting the inspector's report, but the weight of the envelope told her it contained more than a single page. Inside was a detailed summary of Daniel Price's findings, including photographs of her bedroom window with the narrow passage clearly measured against building code requirements. His notes were direct. Placement of industrial generator in this location during nighttime hours would exceed permissible residential noise limits by a significant margin, posing potential health risks due to sustained decibel exposure. Beneath, that, in smaller print, was a line stating that the matter had been referred to the city attorney for review under retaliatory nuisance provisions. It was the first time any official document had acknowledged what she had known from the beginning, that this was not some harmless routine test, but an act designed to target her. She was still reading when her phone rang. The caller ID was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end introduced herself as a paralegal from the city attorney's office, requesting that Madeline be available later that afternoon to meet with an investigator who wanted to collect additional information. She agreed, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to relief, not because she thought the matter was about to be resolved, but because it was no longer invisible to the people who could act on it. At 2 o'clock sharp, a dark sedan pulled up in front of her house, and a man in a plain suit stepped out, introducing himself simply as Investigator Caldwell. He carried no visible badge, but his demeanor was official enough to leave no doubt. Once inside, he asked her to recount the events from the first noise complaint to the most recent incidents, occasionally stopping to clarify details about times, dates, and the people she had seen. When she mentioned Greg's account of the two men unloading the generator and the connection to Karen, his expression did not change, but his pen moved quickly across the page. He examined the threatening note she had received, the policy review letter from the property management, and the inspection notice, making copies of everything before placing the originals back in the folder she had been keeping. When the meeting ended, he stood at the door for a moment, telling her that while he couldn't share specifics of the ongoing inquiry, she should know that this isn't the first time we've seen this pattern. The words stayed with her long after he left. That night, she sat in her workshop, the ticking of half a dozen clocks filling the room, when she heard the low growl of an engine outside. It wasn't the same heavy rumble as the generator, but it was close enough to send a shiver down her spine. She moved quietly to the front window and saw the unmarked white SUV parked across the street, headlights off, the silhouette of the driver barely visible behind the glass. She stood there, not moving, letting the seconds stretch until the SUV's brake lights flared and it rolled slowly away into the dark. In the morning, she found a folded piece of paper on her doorstep with nothing but the words, "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," written in the same uneven font as the earlier note. She didn't hesitate this time. She called Caldwell directly, and within an hour, 2 city vehicles and a police cruiser were parked outside. They photographed the note, dusted it for prints, and canvassed the immediate area, speaking to neighbors. She could see Karen watching from her porch, her arms folded, a small, satisfied smile tugging at her mouth until one of the officers walked over to speak to her. The exchange was brief, but when it ended, Karen's expression had lost its smugness. Later that day, Caldwell returned with a simple update. The city attorney's office was moving forward with formal action, and she should be prepared to provide testimony if needed. It was not a promise of victory, but it was enough to let her breathe for the first time in weeks. As the sun set that evening, the street felt different. Still tense, still watchful, but no longer hers to defend alone. 2 weeks later, the official letter arrived, stamped and signed by the city attorney's office, stating that the retaliatory acts directed at Madeleine had been substantiated through witness statements, documented evidence, and the inspector's report. The property management was ordered to cease any form of targeted activity against her, and the individuals identified in the investigation, including the 2 men who had placed the generator, were banned from entering the premises under threat of criminal trespass charges. The letter further noted that one resident, unnamed but obvious to Madeleine, had been served with a formal notice of violation, carrying both a fine and a mandatory hearing. Reading it, she felt no surge of triumph, only a steady quiet in her chest, like the first deep breath after being underwater too long. That afternoon, she stepped outside to find the street unusually still. Karen's porch was empty, her car gone, and the neighbor across the way who had once avoided eye contact lifted a hand in a brief but genuine greeting. In the days that followed, there were no strange vehicles idling on the block, no envelopes without return addresses, no sounds in the night that didn't belong. She reopened her shop fully, letting the scent of oiled wood and brass fill the rooms, and for the first time since this began, she worked without glancing toward the window every few minutes. The quiet that returned was not the same as before. She knew now how quickly it could be shattered, how deliberate malice could be disguised as procedure, but it was hers again, reclaimed not through confrontation, but through the steady, disciplined choice to act within the lines while refusing to be cornered. And, though she did not linger on it, she understood that her file, thick with notes and letters, would remain in her desk drawer for as long as she lived here. A reminder that peace was something you guarded as much as you enjoyed,